Welcome to this new episode of the interview series on bilaterals.org. Today I am with Stefan Christoff. Stefan is a media maker, musician, and community activist living in Montreal. And my first question to you, Stefan, will be to what extent do you think Canada's trade deal are a legacy of its colonial history?
It's essential to locate Canadian economic policy within the history of this quote unquote country. Canada as a project foundationally is a crown corporation, an extension of British imperial interests internationally. Hudson's Bay Company was the foundation of Canada as an institution, which was rooted in dispossessing Indigenous lands, territories, and resources. This is the origin point for Canadian economic policy. When we think about Canadian economic policy today, whether it's through corporate sector initiatives or governmental trade agreements, they are profoundly shaped by this history. If we think back to the foundation, for example, of even multilateral institutions like the G20, the Liberal Party, which is in power right now in Canada, was foundational to that process. And if we think to other initiatives like the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, the MAI, which was struck down, or the Free Trade Area of the Americas Agreement, which was struck down, both in response to social movement pressure, the Canadian government was central to both of those initiatives in terms of the corporatization of trade policy and investment policy globally. And although the tactics and political rhetoric are different than the United States, there's a very important configuration of political interests that are central to both projects as colonial nation states.
Why do you think then many still see Canada as a nice progressive country as opposed to the US that is supposed to be the bad guy, so to speak? You know, if we're talking about perception, many people around the world see the US as very aggressive as opposed to Canada. And even though, as you mentioned, Canada has had a violent history as well.
I think that there's overt violence and then there's systemic violence that happens in a more subtle way that is harder to track. So if we're thinking about the realities of economic policy, I think it's a very good way. It's an important window through which we can see the nature of the Canadian state and corporate apparatus. When we think about the juxtaposition of the United States and Canada, again, there's been examples where Canadian policy has differentiated itself from US policy, but often that is as a result of social movements on both sides of the border shaping and contesting economic policy. So now social movements in Canada, the origin point of those movements being Indigenous resistance to colonialism. Over time, we saw also various forces take root within, agricultural communities, within worker, urban networks, the formation of labor unions. All those forces are much stronger than mainstream historical narratives give credit to. And a lot of social policies that the Canadian state claims in terms of the global image of Canada are a result of the struggle of these social movements over years. Indigenous people struggled for a lot of some of the environmental protection laws that exist in Canada, which the government's currently trying to strip away. Social institutions like healthcare, some labor rights that exist are a result of struggle of social movements over generations. So the government, after the fact, after they've been forced in different examples to adopt policies that might seem progressive internationally, which they then play and manipulate to use for an image to sell corporate trade agreements globally, those policies were never the initiative of the state. They were always the initiatives of social movements or anti-colonial movements that were contesting the original violence, colonial economic violence that is foundational to Canada.
In that sense, you recently wrote about the renegotiation process of the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement. Do you see a strong link between Canada's history, colonial history, and the history of Israel in connection to the situation in Palestine?
Thanks for mentioning this, Nicholas. And I think that, what's important, to be honest with you, is often, when we think about movements for justice, human rights, ecology, we can have questions about the ways that those frameworks are co-opted by international institutions, human rights particularly. There's an important critique to be had about the nature of who gives rights, who owns the rights framework. But as it stands, what I'm trying to refer to in this conversation specifically is the fact that when we think about the reasons and the orientation of supporting human rights, so for example, in Palestine, as you mentioned, the focus of our opposition to, for example, the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, we're talking about trade agreements here and multilateral and bilateral trade agreements, shouldn't revolve around this being an exception. It's not just happenstance that this agreement took place. It was one of the first trade agreements that Canada signed. It was first signed in 1997. NAFTA was in 1994. Before that was the Canada-US trade agreement, I believe in 1988. The Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement is not an exception to policy. It's about colonialism, and it's about a similar economic framework that exists in both places, although the economies of the Israeli colonial state and the Canadian colonial state are different. There is the manifest destiny framework that is foundational to both places. Frontierism, this concept of the political imaginary shaped by expansion, innovation, these sort of buzzwords today, I think we need to think critically about, because if we're thinking about the celebration of the Israeli tech sector, for example, we've seen the ramifications of what that means through the Pegasus spyware scandal. That's just one example. I mean, there's a whole plethora of tech organizations, companies connected to the Israeli state security establishment that are playing a role internationally. When we think about a trade agreement like the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, it is to support those corporations. Specifically, that agreement is revolved around the tech sector and quote unquote innovation. Well, innovation has sort of been given this positive spin, but what does innovation mean if we're talking about, working with a government that backs corporations that are involved in projects like Pegasus spyware? There's no accounting for this. If we think about on the Canadian side, this trade agreement, it's not an exception. So what I mean is that it is not surprising that the Canadian government wants to engage with the Israeli state in this trade agreement, given that the entire identity framework politically and economically of Canada is also rooted in innovative expansionism of a colonial framework, rooted in Western European conceptions of time and history. The Western parts of so-called Canada, if we think about today, are still being contested. If we think about the Shuswap Nation, the Wet'suwet'en Nation, many other Indigenous communities who today still question the very essence and existence of the Canadian state. But it shows, I think, the vulnerabilities of the Canadian colonial project, because in a very essential way, the economy of Canada is rooted in the exploitation of natural resources of Indigenous lands. And, huge sections of British Columbia, as it's called, its colonial name, there is no treaty for those regions, right? So Canada is negotiating these international trade agreements, international policy, without actually having a legal framework for its own existence over a lot of territories that it claims to be part of Canada. And this is why Canada is so frightened by Indigenous protests.
Speaking of corporations, Canadian companies have also been quite aggressive throughout the world in terms of investment and the way they also sue countries in arbitration court, especially countries from the global south. For me, this is also direct legacy of the colonial history of Canada, and the Israel-Canada FTA renegotiation is just another step further. But one particular point that I found interesting in your article is the fact that in the Israel-Canada Free Trade Agreement, there is no distinction between Israeli products that are produced in Israel and those coming from the settlements in Palestine. Is this something new that came up in renegotiation?
The agreement never made any differentiation between settlement products within the Canada-Israel trade agreement, signed in '97. So if you look on the Canadian Foreign Affairs website, Canada doesn't recognize the legitimacy of Israeli colonial settlements within occupied Palestine. I mean, obviously they're a violation of, a whole bunch of international legal frameworks, the Geneva Convention being one of them. And so there's a contradiction in Canadian policy here, where foreign affairs actually articulates these settlements as illegal, Israeli settlements, and the economic production that happens within them. But the trade agreement doesn't differentiate between policies produced in these colonial settlements and what is considered to be Israel proper, as it's defined by pre-1967 borders, borders established after the dispossession of Palestinians that happened in '48 and before the occupation of the West Bank that happened in the 1967 war. So yeah, there's no distinction made between products. That's a violation of Canada's own policy. So I think that the trade agreement itself is very questionable, and it shows a lot around the hypocrisy of the Canadian Liberal government. So I think that that's sort of like intentionality is important, right? Like image is one thing, but process and legal specifics are another. So when we look at like the contemporary negotiations around other trade agreements, you mentioned the ways that, Canada tried to manipulate its image to push forward the European Union Canada trade agreement. There's specific negotiations happening right now around an FTA between Canada and Indonesia. There's one of Canada and the ASEAN area. And so I think that the actual reality of the bilateral trade agreement with Israel and how it violates, human rights law, Canada's own policy is contradicted. around that, it shapes a corporate vision and colonial vision that is central to Canadian trade policy, right? So we can't distinguish between Canada's interests as a colonial force in terms of Indigenous people within Canada and how that's manifested internationally with corporate trade agreements. Because we know what happens if we think about Indonesia, we think about the role of mining corporations, we think about the role of also industrial production. There's a violence there that is profound, right? These trade agreements facilitate corporate investment and push forward frameworks where labor rights, environmental protection are not respected, right? So these aren't exceptions. These trade agreements are a manifestation of colonial policy internationally. And Canada's government pushes this, right? So the Canada-Israel trade agreement is just one example in this broader process of colonial expansionism that is at the origin point of the Canadian institution as a state, because it started as a corporation.
And maybe just one last question. Earlier this year, there was a letter in Canada from several movements and people, activists, calling for the end of the Israeli-Canada Free Trade Agreement. And sorry, my daughter is screaming in the background. I hope it's not too disturbing. It's actually sometimes really hard to raise awareness on these issues among some movements. And what do you think could be done to further raise awareness on these issues, like from, to get more movements on board, like whether they are Indigenous movement or environmental movements and so on?
Well, we have to locate and understand trade policy as a manifestation of broader political and economic interests. These policies are just basically a manifestation of the larger systems of violence that social movements are critiquing, right? And so they're one mechanism, right? Like, bilaterals.org, I think, is an important resource because it tracks these trade agreements. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, in Canada, tracks Canada's negotiation of trade agreements, for example, often, and they do important work on this front. Even the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Occupied Territories of the West Bank and Gaza, Michael Link, who's a labor lawyer from, who's based in Windsor, Ontario, has written about and spoken about at the United Nations Canadian trade agreements with Israel, well, specifically the Canada-Israel trade agreement. So all these, what I'm trying to say is that, to try to respond, the questions are very broad, but I think one thing that brings a lot of these points together is that we can't decouple trade agreements from broader critiques of militarism or human rights violations or environmental degradation, right? Like, trade agreements are the technical mechanisms through which colonial legal processes insert themselves to control territories, lands, resources, and labor. They're the mechanisms, the gears of that process, right? So I think we need to understand that these systems of political control and colonial violence don't just happen. There's mechanisms through which they're manifested, and trade agreements are essential in that the mechanical workings of the colonial economic system.